the emperor who changed his mind. In 261 BCE, the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka won the greatest military victory of his career. He stood in the kingdom of Kalinga, present-day Odisha, surrounded by the results: 100,000 dead, 150,000 deported. Many times that number perished in the aftermath. He had won, and he felt the weight of what he had done. What happened next changed the world. If you have wondered why Buddhism, a teaching that began in one corner of northern India, eventually reached Japan, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, and eventually your living room, tonight is the answer. Most major world religions traveled with armies. Buddhism, across an entire continent, did not. No crusades, no forced mass conversions as the engine of its spread. Tonight, how it happened, and the man who set it on the road. In a garden in Sri Lanka, there is a tree. It was planted, according to the tradition, in 288 BCE, a cutting from the tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment. It still grows today, and it got there because one emperor, after walking across a battlefield, decided to try a different approach. Chapter 1: The Edict and the Man. The Mauryan Empire, in the 3rd century BCE, was the largest political entity the Indian subcontinent had ever known, approximately 5 million square kilometers, stretching from what is now Afghanistan in the west, to Bengal in the east, to deep into the Deccan Plateau in the south, a territory larger than any empire that would rule India until the British, 2,000 years later. Its capital was Pataliputra, present-day Patna, on the banks of the Ganges. The dynasty had been founded by Chandragupta Maurya, the grandfather, passed to Bindusara, the son, and then, around 268 BCE, to the 3rd emperor. His name was Ashoka. We know him today by 2 names: Ashoka, meaning without sorrow, and the name he gave himself on his stones, Devanampiya Piyadasi, beloved of the gods, he who looks on with affection. You should know something about how we know what we know about him, because almost every story you might have heard, that he killed 99 of his brothers to take the throne, that he kept a torture chamber called Ashoka's Hell, that he converted to Buddhism in a single dramatic moment after seeing the bodies on the field. Almost all of it comes from later texts, Buddhist hagiographies written centuries after his death, designed to teach a moral lesson, not to record a history. What we actually have are his own words, carved into stone around the empire while he was still alive. Approximately 4,000 words. They are the earliest decipherable written records from India, and they speak in the first person. It helps to think of our sources at 3 levels. At the top, the edicts, rocks and pillars scattered across what was once his empire, inscribed by his order. Some still stand where he placed them. These are the most reliable source we have. They are also remarkably candid, more candid than you might expect the king's official inscriptions to be. Below that, the Sri Lankan chronicles, the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa, written 400 to 800 years after Ashoka's death by Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka. They preserve a tradition, but they were written with a purpose, to show how Buddhism came to Sri Lanka, and to credit Ashoka as the great patron who made that possible. Historians treat them with respect and with caution, and at the bottom, the hagiographies, the Ashokavadana, the Divyavadana, texts composed several centuries after his life, full of miracles, demons, and dramatic conversions. They tell us what later Buddhists wanted Ashoka to have been. They do not tell us what he was. The story of the 99 brothers comes from this third layer. Most scholars dismiss it. Ashoka likely had brothers. He likely faced a succession struggle, as Mauryan princes did. What he did to them, we do not know. The tradition says one thing. The stones do not confirm it. For 2,000 years, those stones could not be read. The script Ashoka used was called Brahm, the parent of nearly every script used in South and Southeast Asia today, but extinct as a reading language by roughly the 4th century CE. The inscriptions sat in plain sight for centuries. Travelers noticed them. No one knew what they said. That changed in the late 1830s in Calcutta. James Prinsep, an English mint master with a gift for cryptography, worked through the Brahm characters letter by letter, comparing them across inscriptions until the script gave way. When the words came through, they did not name an emperor anyone had been expecting. They named someone called Devanampia Piyadasi. It took years more, and the discovery of other inscriptions, to confirm that this beloved of the gods was the same man the Buddhist chronicles called Ashoka. For the first time in 2 millennia, Ashoka spoke in his own voice, and the thing he wanted to talk about, more than anything else, was a war. The Kalinga campaign took place in the 8th year of his reign, by most reckoning, 261 BCE. Kalinga was a coastal kingdom on the eastern seaboard of India, in what is today the state of Odisha. It was wealthy. It controlled trade routes south, and it was independent. One of the few significant territories not under Mauryan rule. Ashoka conquered it. What he wrote about that conquest, on a rock now identified as Major Rock Edict XIII, is unlike anything else from the ancient world. Here is how it opens, in the translation of the scholar Patrick Olivelle. 8 years after the royal consecration of the beloved of the gods, King Piyadasi, the Kalingas were conquered, a standard royal opening. Then the numbers, in the translation of the historian Romila Thapar, whose rendering is the most widely circulated. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many times that number perished. And then, the part that has no precedent, the king of the largest empire in India, at the height of his power, wrote this onto his own rocks for his own subjects to see. On conquering Kalinga, the beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous to the beloved of the gods and weighs heavily on his mind. Kings do not, as a rule, broadcast their regrets in stone. The traditional story, the one you may have grown up hearing, is that this was the moment. Ashoka walked the battlefield, saw what he had done, and converted. The warrior became the saint, a thunderbolt of transformation. The edicts complicate that story. There is another inscription, Minor Rock Edict I, in which Ashoka records something interesting about his religious life. In the translation of Bhikkhu Dhammika, it is now more than 2.5 years since I became a lay disciple, but until now I have not been very zealous. But now that I have visited the Sangha for more than a year, I have become very zealous, a lay disciple, an upasaka, for more than 2.5 years already, before Kalinga, before the bodies on the field. The conversion was not a moment. It was a deepening of something that had begun quietly before the war that everyone remembers, which, if you think about it, is exactly what the teaching would predict. Scholars have spent decades debating what this all means. Romila Thapar, who has spent more time with these inscriptions than perhaps any historian alive, argues that Ashoka's transformation was both sincere and politically useful, and that this is fine. A diverse empire needed an integrating ethic. The Dhamma he began to promote served that purpose. The sincerity and the strategy were not in conflict. They reinforced each other. The historian Nyanjot Lahiri resists the language of miraculous transformation altogether. She reads Ashoka as a complex, self-aware political actor, not a saint, but not a cynic either. A man trying, with mixed success, to govern an enormous territory according to a set of principles he had genuinely come to hold. We do not need to settle what was in Ashoka's heart. What the edicts record is remarkable enough on its own, but there is one detail in the record that deserves attention. Scholars have noticed it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Major Rock Edict XIII, the Great Apology, the famous statement of remorse, has been found at sites all across the former empire. At Shabazgarhi in the northwest, at Khalsi in the foothills of the Himalayas, at Eragudi in the south. It was meant to be read everywhere. It is missing from Kalinga itself. At Dhauli, near present-day Bhubaneswar, and at Jogada, further south, both inscription sites located inside the conquered kingdom. Edict XIII is not there. In its place, the king put something different. He put what scholars call the separate edicts, Dhauli, Jogada. Instructions to his officials, reminders about just governance, and this line, "All men are my children." The people Ashoka had devastated received instructions to be treated justly. They did not receive his apology in writing, whether that was wisdom or avoidance, or some other thing for which we do not have a clean word. Only he knew. The stones are silent on the reason, but they are not silent on the omission. This, the edicts, the gradual conversion, the missing apology, the messy and self-conscious man, is who Ashoka actually was. Not the saint of the chronicles, not the monster of the hagiographies. A king on a continent, working out in stone what he thought a kingdom should be. What he decided next changed how a religion could travel. Chapter 2. The Dhamma and the Missions. After Kalinga, what Ashoka did next was unusual in a way that is easy to miss if you assume you already know the story. He did not, as far as we can tell from the edicts, simply convert to Buddhism and try to make his empire Buddhist. He did something stranger and more carefully thought through. He began to inscribe across his territories a public ethic. He called it Dhamma. The word Dhamma, in its Buddhist sense, means something like the teaching of the Buddha, the law of how things actually are. But that is not exactly what Ashoka meant by the word on his stones. Or rather, that is part of what he meant, but it is not all of what he meant. And the difference matters. When his inscriptions were translated for the western edges of his empire, the regions where Greek and Aramaic were the languages of administration, his translators had to find a word for Dhamma. The Greek versions chose eusebeia, piety. The Aramaic versions chose a word meaning truth. Neither of these is Buddhism. Both of them point to something broader, a way of living, available to anyone, defined by what you do, rather than what you believe. Read the major edicts and you can see this for yourself. Ashoka funded rest houses on the major roads. He planted shade trees for travelers. He had wells dug. He provided medical care for humans, and, the edicts specifically say, for animals. He honored Brahmins. He honored Jains. He honored Ajvikas, an ascetic tradition older than Buddhism. He honored the Buddhist Sangha. He gave to them all. He appointed officials called Dhamma Mahamatras, officers of the Dhamma, whose job, according to his pillar edicts, was to look after the welfare of every religious community in his empire, not just one. In Edict XII, he was direct about what this meant. Here is one rendering of that edict. In a translation, the philosopher and economist Amartya Sen brought to modern attention in his book, The Argumentative Indian, he who does reverence to his own sect while disparaging the sects of others wholly from attachment to his own sect, in reality inflicts, by such conduct, the severest injury on his own sect. A king, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, carving into rock, for his own subjects to read, in all the major languages of his empire, that elevating your own tradition by putting down others actually damages your own tradition. This is not the religious history one might expect. It does not mean Ashoka was not a Buddhist. He was. We can see his personal commitment plainly in a separate inscription, the so-called Bharat Edict, in which he speaks not as a king to his subjects, but as a layman to the monastic community. He names specific Buddhist texts he recommends. He expresses, in the translation of Bhikkhu Dhammika, his reverence and faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. 2 layers then. Personal commitment expressed to fellow Buddhists, public ethic broadcast to everyone, a Dhamma that any reasonable person of any tradition could embrace. Non-violence, honesty, respect for elders, care for the vulnerable, restraint in speech, generosity to all who seek the good. It is worth pausing on what this was, because nothing quite like it had existed at imperial scale before. In an earlier video, we explored the Kalama Sutta, the Buddha's instruction to a community of skeptics on how to evaluate a teaching. Test it by what it leads to, harm or benefit, cultivated by the wise or condemned by them. Then act accordingly. Ashoka, on his stones, was doing something close to this at imperial scale. He was articulating a public ethic not as commandment from above, not as the will of a god, but as a set of practices that any honest person examining them would recognize as conducive to a better life for everyone. What he then tried to do with that ethic is among the boldest projects in the political history of ideas. He sent it out. Major Edict XIII, the same edict that records his remorse over Kalinga, also names 5 foreign kings to whom Ashoka claims to have sent emissaries of the Dhamma. 5 kings in the Hellenistic world that Alexander the Great's conquests had left behind a generation before. Antiochus II, ruler of the Seleucid Empire stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India. Ptolemy II in Egypt. Antigonus II in Macedonia. Magus in Cyrene in what is now Libya, and Alexander, named in the edict, identified in different scholarly readings as either the king of Epirus or of Corinth. Edict II goes further. It claims that Ashoka provided medical care for both humans and animals in these foreign territories. Imagine that, a Mauryan emperor claiming on stone that he was paying for clinics in the Mediterranean. What we know is what the edict says. What we do not know is what actually happened. No Greek source, no Hellenistic historian, no chronicle, no inscription from any of these kingdoms records the arrival of Buddhist emissaries. No mention of Indian missionaries in Alexandria. No reference in Macedonian texts to monks at the court of Antigonus. Whether the missions reached these courts, whether they were received, whether they had any effect, whether they even arrived at all, we do not know. The honest position is this: the edicts make the claim. The Western record is silent. Something was almost certainly sent. Ashoka was not in the habit of carving lies for his own subjects to verify against his court. But how far it traveled And what it changed is one of the great unknowns of ancient history. There is one mission, however, whose results we can trace, not from Ashoka's edicts, where it does not appear by name, but from the chronicles and from the ground. It is the mission to the island of Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan chronicles, the Mahavamsa in particular, tell the story in detail. A monk named Mahinda, identified in the Sri Lankan tradition as Ashoka's son, and identified in the later writings of the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang as his brother, was sent across the strait to the court of the Sri Lankan king Devanampiya Tissa. The chronicle places the meeting in the month that is now called Posan, June by our calendar, the time of the full moon, in roughly 247 BCE. The king was hunting deer near Mihintale, a rocky hill rising above the plain northeast of his capital. Mahinda and a small group of monks stood on the summit and called out to him, according to the Mahavamsa. Before Mahinda would teach the king anything about the Dhamma, he tested him. The test was strange and famous. Mahinda pointed to a mango tree and asked, "Is this a mango tree?" The king said yes. "Are there other mango trees besides this one?" "Yes." "Are there other trees that are not mango trees?" "Yes." "Are there other trees besides this mango tree, and besides the other mango trees, and besides the trees that are not mangoes?" The king paused, then said, "Yes, this mango tree." He had recognized that the original mango tree had been counted in the first set, but was also being asked about as an individual thing. He could hold the distinction. He could think this way. "Thou art wise, O ruler of men," the chronicle has Mahinda say. And then he began to teach. The text he chose for that first teaching, according to the chronicle, was the Kulahattipadapama Sutta, MN 27, the lesser discourse on the elephant's footprint simile, a teaching on what the Buddhist path actually looks like when someone undertakes it. The king sat. By the end, he and his court were Buddhists. This is the story as the Mahavamsa tells it. The mango tree test, the hunting expedition, the Posan full moon. These are details preserved by monks writing several centuries after the events they describe, in a text intended to celebrate the founding of the Dhamma on the island. They are tradition. We cannot verify the dialogue. We cannot confirm the exact hill, the exact afternoon, the exact words. What we can confirm is that the meeting on that hill is still remembered. Mihintale, 23 centuries later, is a place of pilgrimage. Every Posan, the hill fills with people. Sometime after that first meeting, the chronicle says, Mahinda's sister Sanghamita followed. She brought with her a cutting from the tree under which the Buddha had attained enlightenment, 650 kilometers to the north. The cutting was planted in the royal grounds at Anuradhapura. This is the chronicle's account. It is tradition, written several centuries later, by monks with a religious purpose. The specific details, Mahinda's exact relationship to Ashoka, the precise sequence of events, are not corroborated in the edicts, but here is what the ground tells us. Archaeological evidence from Sri Lanka confirms that Buddhism was present on the island in the 3rd century BCE. Pottery inscribed with Buddhist symbols, the remains of early monastic settlements, the broad fact that the chronicle preserves, that Buddhism arrived in Sri Lanka during or just after Ashoka's reign, is supported by what we can dig up. The narrative around it is tradition. The transmission itself is real. And from Sri Lanka, the teaching kept moving. What followed, over the centuries after Ashoka's death, was the slowest and most distributed religious diffusion in human history. Buddhist monks attached themselves to merchant caravans heading north and west, along what would later be called the Silk Road. They settled in oasis cities Khotan, Kucha, Danwang, where monasteries became the local centers of literacy, translation, and learning. They moved into Central Asia, from there into China, from China eventually to Korea, from Korea to Japan. In the other direction, the teaching moved south and east along trade routes, into mainland Southeast Asia, across the seas to the islands of what is now Indonesia. The monks of Sri Lanka, in turn, sent teachings back across to Burma and the regions that would become Thailand and Cambodia. We know the names of some of the individuals who carried this transmission. Faxian, a Chinese monk who walked from China to India in the early 5th century to collect texts. Kumarajva, born in what is now Kyrgyzstan, who became one of the great translators bringing Buddhist material from Sanskrit into Chinese. Xuanzang, in the 7th century, whose 17-year pilgrimage from China to India and back became one of the most documented journeys of the ancient world. These were not soldiers. They were travelers, monks, translators, carriers of texts. Consider Faxian's journey, since he is the one for whom we have the most direct account. He left China in the year 399 of the Common Era, already, by most reckonings, an older monk, on foot, walking westward across the Taklamakan, the desert that travelers of the period called the Desert of Death. He crossed the Pamir Mountains. He reached India. He stayed for years, walking between monastic universities, copying out Buddhist texts in Sanskrit to carry home. Eventually, he made his way south to Sri Lanka. At Anuradhapura, he visited the Sri Mahabodhi. He stood, nearly 7 centuries after Sanghamitra had planted it, at the same tree. He continued his return by ship eastward, was nearly lost at sea, and finally reached the coast of China again. 15 years after he had set out, in his 70s, carrying with him a load of texts that would shape Chinese Buddhism for the next 1,000 years. He wrote his account of the journey afterward, and we still have it. This is what the spread of Buddhism actually looked like in practice. An old monk, walking, with a bundle of books. Ashoka did not personally arrange any of this. He died in roughly 232 BCE. Most of what we have been describing happened in the centuries after he was gone. But the chronicles and the archaeology agree on this. The momentum of transmission, the model of a teaching that traveled by example and text, and the movement of individual people was set in motion during his reign. He sent the first official missions. He framed his ethic in the universal terms that allowed it to travel. He showed what an emperor could do when he chose to spread an idea by speaking it rather than by enforcing it. What he gave was momentum. The world's curiosity carried it from there. Chapter 3. Without Swords. Now we can be precise about what this means. The claim is not that Buddhism has always been peaceful. That would be false, and any historian would correct it. The claim is about a mechanism, about how the teaching traveled, about what the engine of its transmission was. Among the religions that achieved continent-scale spread, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism stands out in this regard. Its primary mechanism of transmission was not military conquest. There is no Buddhist equivalent anywhere in the historical record of a crusade, a religious war launched to take territory in the name of the faith. There is no Buddhist equivalent of the Spanish Inquisition. There is no Buddhist equivalent of the forced mass baptism of conquered peoples that accompanied European colonization in the Americas. There is no Buddhist equivalent of the early Islamic conquests that brought a new religion as a condition of imperial integration to vast regions in a few generations. When you look at the moments where Buddhism did encounter conquering armies, The pattern, strikingly, runs the other way. When Mongol cavalry swept across Central Asia in the 13th century, they did not impose Buddhism on the populations they conquered. Within a few generations, the Mongol courts themselves had converted, and the teaching they came to revere had been carried to them by Tibetan and Sakya monks moving along diplomatic routes that already existed. The conquerors became the converted. This pattern repeats. The teaching tended to arrive at the courts of rulers, who then promoted it among their subjects through patronage rather than compulsion. The army was rarely the vehicle. When an army was involved, it was usually because the soldiers themselves, or their ruler, had already changed their minds. This is not because Christianity and Islam lack peaceful transmission histories. They do not lack them. Christianity spread for 3 centuries before Constantine without state power, carried by communities living in difficult conditions, what they preached. Islam reached much of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, parts of the southern Philippines, through Sufi missionaries and Muslim merchants whose method was teaching and example, not conquest. Both traditions have substantial records of peaceful spread. Both also have substantial records of coercive spread. What is unusual about Buddhism is the balance, the absence, across 2.5 millennia of transmission, of large-scale military conquest as the engine of its expansion. This is also not the same as saying Buddhists have always behaved peacefully. They have not. The Sri Lankan civil war of the 20th century, a conflict that lasted nearly 3 decades and cost tens of thousands of lives, saw Buddhist monks participating in nationalist movements that drew, in part, on Buddhist identity as part of an ethnic and political program. The 2010s in Myanmar saw monks aligned with the violence carried out against the Rohingya, a violence which serious Buddhist teachers inside and outside the country have spoken about with grief and direct condemnation. The Zen Buddhist institutions of Imperial Japan supported the military expansionism of the early 20th century, providing chaplains, theological support, and public legitimation for a war that left tens of millions of dead, in ways that post-war Japanese Buddhists, especially within the Zen lineages, have spent decades trying to understand, document, and atone for. These are not footnotes. They are real episodes in which people who identified as Buddhist did terrible things, and in which Buddhist institutions failed to restrain them or actively encourage them. The history of Buddhism is the history of a human institution. Human institutions, given enough time, do not have clean records. The thesis is narrower than Buddhism is peaceful. The thesis is this: when you ask how the teaching of an Indian renunciant in the 5th or 6th century BCE became, over the next 1,000 years, the practice of tens of millions of people from Persia to Japan, from Indonesia to Mongolia, the answer is not an army carried it there. Something else carried it. And the man on whose stones we have been reading was not himself a pacifist. We should be clear about that too. The same Edict XIII that records Ashoka's remorse over Kalinga, in its full text, beyond the lines that get quoted, contains a warning. To the forest peoples of his empire, the indigenous communities at the edges of Mauryan territory, Ashoka writes that they should be told he is repentant, but also that the beloved of the gods is not only compassionate, but is firm in his purpose, and that he has the power to punish them if necessary. He kept the army. He kept the apparatus of state. He issued separate inscriptions, the so-called schism edicts, Sarnath, Sanchi, Kosambi, found at Sarnath, Sanchi, and Kosambi, instructing that any monk or nun who attempted to split the unity of the Sangha be forced to wear white robes, the dress of lay people, and be removed from monastic residence, forced laicization by imperial decree. Ashoka used the apparatus of the state to discipline what he had come to revere. He governed an empire of millions, and an empire of millions cannot be governed without the threat of force. The point is not that Ashoka renounced power. The point is what he did with it. What he did, you can read in Edict XIII, his longest inscription, issued near the end of his reign, summarizing his program. He had banyan trees planted along the major roads for the shade of travelers and their animals. He ordered the planting of mango groves. He had wells dug at intervals, every 9 miles, by some readings of the edict, along the routes that crossed his empire. He built rest houses for travelers with watering tanks beside them. He provided medical care for humans and for animals. For animals, he had veterinary clinics established, and the medicinal herbs they required cultivated in places where they did not grow on their own. He elevated officers whose job was the welfare of religious communities, of all religious communities. He sent edicts in languages he did not personally read, so that the people who did read them could understand his ethic. And in that same edict, uncharacteristically for a king, Ashoka reflects on what he has actually been able to achieve. He distinguishes, in his own words, between 2 ways he has tried to promote the Dhamma: by regulation and by conviction, by order and by example. He acknowledges plainly that regulation has achieved little, conviction has achieved much. This is an emperor on a pillar, telling his successors that coercion is the weaker of the 2 tools he has tried. It is the same insight applied to internal governance that the spread of his teaching would prove on the larger scale. An ethic carries further when it is shown than when it is enforced. The scholar Patrick Olivelle summarizes him this way: a ruler, a Buddhist, a moral philosopher, and an ecumenist. All 4 at once, not in tension, in synthesis. This is what the Mauryan Empire began to look like under Ashoka, a state whose visible activities, beyond the ordinary work of governance, included shade trees, wells, clinics, rest houses, and the inscription of an ethic. This is the picture we have, from the stones, of a continent-scale political project in the 3rd century BCE. It did not last. Ashoka died around 232 BCE. The empire he had built held together, in some form, for another 50 years. The last Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, was assassinated around 185 BCE by his own commander-in-chief, a general named Pushyamitra Shunga. The Mauryan dynasty ended. The territory it had administered broke into smaller states, and the Shunga dynasty that succeeded the Mauryas was a Brahmanical revival, a return, in many respects, to the religious frame that had preceded Ashoka's experiment. Some later Buddhist sources accused Pushyamitra of persecuting Buddhists and destroying monasteries. Scholars debate how literally to take those accounts. What is not debated is that the synthesis Ashoka had built was specifically his synthesis, and it did not survive him by long. Later historians, looking for an explanation, sometimes argued that it was Ashoka's pacifism that did it, that by promoting non-violence he had weakened the army, that by funding the Sangha he had drained the treasury, that the empire fell because its emperor had been too good for it. Romila Thapar, in the work that has defined the historiography of the Mauryan decline since the early 1960s, disagrees. The reasons the empire fell, she argues, were structural. It was too large to administer with the technologies of communication and transport available. It was too dependent on the personal vision of a single ruler. Its successor administrators were weaker, Its fiscal foundations were strained by the scale of the welfare projects it had taken on. The empires that came after were smaller, because empires of that size were difficult to maintain at all in the conditions of ancient India. Not because their predecessor had been insufficiently warlike, the empire fell, but by then, the dhamma had been set in motion. Sri Lanka had a Buddhist community and a tree. The Hellenistic kings had received whatever the missions to them had been. Buddhist monks were already moving along the trade routes that would carry the teaching, century by century, to the rest of Asia. The book had been opened. The roads had been built. The trees had been planted. What Ashoka had given was not an empire. It was a model for an idea that could travel without an army, that could cross languages and cultures, that could be embraced or refused but never required. A model whose proof would be the centuries after his death. A teaching moving from oasis to oasis, from monastery to monastery, from translator to translator, from one curious person to the next. The Mauryan Empire passed. The model did not. Close. The tree. We began with a tree in a garden in Sri Lanka. Let us go back there now. The tree stands inside a walled enclosure in the city of Anuradhapura, on a raised terrace surrounded by gold-painted railings and the offerings of 2,500 years of pilgrimage. Its branches have been propped up over the centuries. The wood has aged and needs support, but the tree itself is alive, putting out leaves season after season. According to the chronicle that tells its story, the cutting was planted in 288 BCE by Sanghamita, Ashoka's daughter, brought across the sea from the place in northern India, where her father's tradition said the Buddha had attained enlightenment. It is sometimes called the oldest tree in the world. It is not. There are bristlecone pines in California older. There are clonal organisms, networks of genetically identical aspen. Older still, the Sri Bodhi has a different distinction. It is the oldest human-planted tree on Earth, whose planting date is documented in a written record. The record is a chronicle, not a stone. The exact date is preserved by tradition, rather than by Ashoka's edicts. But the tradition is continuous. Generation after generation, the tree has been tended. Generation after generation, the date has been remembered. There is, in a way, a second proof. The original tree in India, the one under which the Buddha himself was said to have attained enlightenment in the town of Bodh Gaya, did not survive. It was, by various accounts, damaged, destroyed, and replaced over the centuries. The tree that stands at Bodh Gaya today is not the original. It is descended, the tradition says, from a cutting that was brought back from Sri Lanka, where Sanghamita's tree had continued to grow. The teaching that Ashoka had sent away in the form of a sapling and a sister returned to its origin when the origin needed it, as a sapling and a sister again. The line had held in the place where it had been planted, because the place where it had been planted had cared for it. The continuity is real. The chain of human attention, the willingness across centuries to protect something fragile, is the thing that makes any of this last. Every year, during the full moon of June, the month the Sri Lankan calendar calls Posan, the hill at Mihintale and the precinct in Anuradhapura fill with people. According to recent reporting, more than 2 million pilgrims are expected during the Posan observances, white-clad, walking, bringing flowers, sitting under the descendant of a tree that the descendants of monks have been protecting since before the Roman Republic. There are pilgrims who come and circle the enclosure in silence. There are pilgrims who sing. There are pilgrims who bring lamps and light them at the base of the surrounding wall. Some bring small copper vessels of water and pour it, with care, near the tree's roots. Some come in family groups across 3 generations, grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, and offer flowers together. It is not, in the deepest sense, a religious ceremony in the way a Western observer might expect. It is closer to a vigil. People come and stay and look at the tree. They do not come because of the tree's age. There are older living things. They come because of what the tree represents. A living connection, however attenuated, however debated in its details, to a decision made 23 centuries ago by an emperor who walked across a battlefield and chose, for reasons that the stones record but cannot fully explain, a different path. They come because the tree is what is left, in a form you can stand in front of that decision. The scholar Patrick Olivelle has given the better part of his career to the study of Ashoka's inscriptions. At the end of his most recent translation, Ashoka, A King and a People, published in 2023, he offered, after several hundred pages of careful philological work, his own final judgment on the man. He wrote, "The best we can say is Ashoka was far ahead of his times, perhaps ahead by a couple of millennia. It is a striking thing for a scholar to say. Olivelle is not given to overstatement. He has read the inscriptions in their original languages, traced their variants across sites, and weighed them against everything else we know about the ancient world. And his summary, after all of that, is that the man who carved these words may have been thinking thoughts that the human species would not catch up to for 2,000 more years. Consider what is still here. He left approximately 4,000 words in stone. They are still readable. Not as inference, not as legend, readable. A line of the king's actual voice, surviving across the collapse of his empire and 20 intervening centuries, and the slow disappearance of the script he used, until an English mint master in the 1830s worked out a way to read them again. They are still in the rocks, where he put them. The tree that his tradition says his daughter planted is still growing. The walls around it have been rebuilt many times. The path to it has been walked by uncountable feet. It is a tree, and it lives. The teaching he chose to transmit, not by sword, but by example, by text, by the movement of monks and merchants and translators along the slow trade routes of a continent, is still being taught, still being argued over, still being studied in seminaries and universities and small reading groups, still being practiced, sat with in the long silence of meditation halls, by people who would have been entirely outside the imagination of a 3rd century BCE Mauryan emperor, people in places he had never heard of, speaking languages that did not exist when he died, working through teachings that were, in his lifetime, still being transmitted orally. He would not have recognized the room where you are sitting. He would not have recognized the device through which this video is reaching you. He would not have recognized, and this would have surprised him most, that most of the people who now hold the teaching he sent on the road hold it without any king, anywhere, ordering them to. The texts he had ordered carved in stone are now on screens, in paperback editions, in libraries on the other side of the planet. The monks he sent across the strait to Sri Lanka have had distant successors in California redwood forests, in Spanish monasteries, in Brazilian retreat centers. The Dhamma he proclaimed for his subjects in 3 languages is now studied in more than 100. None of this was in his plan. The plan was simpler. The plan was, send it out without forcing anyone. And if you have watched this far, on whatever device this video has reached you on, those teachings are now in your living room. A line, of a kind, from a hill in northern India, 2,500 years ago, through the stones of a king, through the chronicles of monks, through the trade routes of a continent, through the long centuries of translation and preservation and rediscovery, to here, tonight, the place you are sitting. This is what Ashoka had set on the road. He did not see most of where it would go. He could not have imagined this room, this language, this evening. But he did the thing that made it possible. He carved an ethic onto rocks. He sent it out without an army. He trusted, in a way that no emperor before him had trusted, that an idea worth holding could carry itself. And the proof, in the end, is not in the inscriptions or the chronicles or the scholarly translations. The proof is the tree. The proof is that you are still hearing the story.